Good morning. Welcome, everybody. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS. When we have public events like this, we always start with a little safety announcement. Nothing's going to happen. I want you to know that. But if we do have to ask you to evacuate, the exits are right back here. These on this side. This is the one that's closest to the stairs that'll take us down to the street. We'll go down. When you get down to into the alley, take two lefts and a right. We'll go over to National Geographic in the courtyard. I'll get some ice cream and we'll sing a song of praise of our salvation. We'll be just fine. Don't worry about it, but follow us if we have to do anything. Kath Hicks is the security officer for this meeting, and so just follow her instructions, please. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you today. This is a very, very important topic, not one that's frequently discussed in policy circles, for good reason. It's because America has such a wholesome and fine framework and history on civil-military relationship. But it is something that we should be examining. Not every country is as lucky as we are. We were very fortunate to have had our first president was a military man, but he enshrined the importance of civilian control of the military as it becomes an enshrined element of our national history. Not all countries have had that luxury. There have been many countries in the world that have wrestled with civilian control of the military. Places like Argentina and Turkey and Pakistan and Venezuela. You know, there are many more countries that have had great problems. We don't. But we do have issues that we ought to be examining. I think we're going to do that today. There is an inherent tension in a democracy that has a significant military establishment. Democracies are inherently horizontal and militaries are vertical. It's hard for democracies to kind of manage themselves and get to a public consensus. And they rely on institutions that are vertical, command-oriented, authoritarian, and have guns. Okay? Now, that's not an issue for us, but there are issues that we do need to examine. And just a few of them I know that we're going to be dealing with today. One is that we've had an all-volunteer force now for 35 years. It's a very good thing. It's given us the finest military in history. And as a rule of thumb, you want to have people that want to be in the military rather than those that don't want to be in the military. So it's a right formula for America, but it is causing a narrowing of the base upon which we draw people who serve in uniform. And we need to ask ourselves, what does that mean? How do we stay connected broadly? It has implications. One of the implications is we increasingly have civilians that are in responsibility or in responsible positions, but they don't have experience with the military. They don't, are they going to be, do they know how to question military judgment? Or are they inclined to be passive? Or are they inclined to be dismissive and just throw the military around without understanding the sacrifice that it comes with military service? I mean, there are a lot of issues that we need to explore. What does it mean when we see politicians that increasingly recruit retired military officers to give them credibility for their campaigns? It used to be that there was a platoon of general officers standing there with the. Now we got companies, okay, that are standing there. And is that something that's good? Is it giving the right impression to the American people about the attitude of the military? We swear an allegiance to the Constitution, not to a president. We swear an allegiance to the Constitution. What does it mean when we start bringing people into the politics of governing rather than governing? So these are important questions. We're going to explore them today, and I'm looking forward very much to hearing what you all have to say. It's going to be good. Kath Hicks is going to launch this for real, and I look forward to listening with you to this introduction and encourage you to be very dynamic and interactive with us today. This is a very important topic. This is not a crisis. There's no crisis in America, but it is an important set of issues that we should be talking about together. Thank you. Kath, come on up here.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathleen Hicks. I direct the International Security Program here, and I'm going to invite onto stage, oh, she's right behind me, Alice Friend, who is a senior fellow here in the International Security Program and is the mastermind of today's activities. What we wanted to do to just kick off the day, we have an incredible wealth of knowledge in this room. Many of them will be on the stage, but not all of them. And as Dr. Hamre said, we really encourage a dynamic interaction. There's only so many people we can put at the front of the room in a one-day event, and we know there are many other people in the room who have a lot to contribute. What we thought we would do is just give a little bit of a beginning appetite whetting on the issue of civil-military relations, again recognizing that many people in this room have as much knowledge, if not more, than certainly Alice and I will bring to bear. And please excuse my use of reading glasses. As Dr. Hamre said, we don't think there's a crisis today, but we are blessed to be living in a time when people are thinking about, writing on, discussing these issues of civil-military relations. As a center, we felt that we could help by shining a spotlight on this issue, by bringing forward scholars, practitioners, folks who have maybe lived in both worlds to talk a little bit from the military and civilian perspective about what they see happening, where we're doing well as a nation, and where the crisis points might be. Following today, our goal is that all of you will be inspired to then take this forward and in your own ways be able to carry on issues on civil-military relations beyond what we're able to do in this small venue. So what we wanted to do to start is just do a little bit of a video that hopefully will give you a sense. What we decided to do slightly arbitrarily started 2001 and come forward just with some visuals to help remind you of some of the context in which civil-military relations have evolved since 9/11. So without further ado, here we go.
In Iraq, we have liberated 25 million people from the tyranny of a brutal dictator. In a few weeks, we'll hand over power to Iraqis, an interim government that will shortly be operating under a constitution that will guarantee freedom to all Iraqi people.
Could you give us some ideas to the magnitude of the Army's force requirement for an occupation of Iraq following a successful completion of the war?
I would say that what's been mobilized to this point is something on the order of several 100,000 soldiers.
This policy is a national policy that results from policies put forward at one end of Pennsylvania Avenue with the advice and consent resources provided at the other.
Accordingly, after discussion with the President and with the support of the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, I have accepted the resignation of the Secretary of the Air Force and the resignation of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force.
So here we are, my friends, with an obvious impact next year of sequestration, which would dramatically impact our ability to defend this nation.
Iran presents the most significant regional threat to stability and security. Its reckless behavior and bellicose rhetoric have created a high potential for miscalculation.
Do any of you disagree with the proposal that we should be not considering how good a military character they have in terms of how well they serve the military as part of the consideration as to whether or not a case should be tried where a felony accusation has been made? Anybody disagree with that? Nobody disagrees with that. Okay, that's good.
As the investigation has moved forward, we can now report there is a total of 92 crew members that have been identified as having some level of involvement. That means either participating in the cheating or knowing something about it and not standing up and reporting it.
Tonight, Americans stand as one, with strength and confidence to overcome the last 8 years of the Obama-Clinton failures. My fellow Americans, I stand with you tonight, a retired 4-star general of the United States Marine Corps.
My intention to nominate General James Mad Dog Mattis as the next Secretary of Defense for the United States of America.
I repeat, there will be no use of military forces in immigration. Disappointment, shock, anger, disgust, and outrage. The Marine Corps I've served for over 40 years has a problem, and we intend to fix it.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I'd just like to say what a privilege it is to be able to continue serving our nation.
Okay, we followed the universal think tank rule of you can never go wrong, ending on an Eisenhower quote. What Alice and I propose to do is to walk you through the logic we tried to use to approach this day. There are many different ways to frame up a day-long event on civil-military relations. What we have chosen to do is focus on policy, politics, and the public, and how civil-military relations play out in each of those realms. I'm going to start on policy and then turn it over to Alice on politics and go back and forth a little bit. So policy, there are a variety of issues that come up here. For the inside Washington crowd, this tends to be what they think about often as the big issues in civil-military relations. This is about what is the proper role of civilian advice, what is the role of independent military advice, civilian direction, excuse me, independent military advice, what constitutes micromanagement, what constitutes good civilian involvement, and how militarized is our public policy. So first, we have up here both two of the models, key models that people think of when they think of civil-military relations in this policy sense. One is the Sam Huntington objective control idea, which is more of a spheres of influence, somewhat linear, if you will. And the other on the bottom is a quote from L.A. Cohen, who has approached the issue differently and speaks of the unequal dialogue, talks about politics flowing all the way from the strategic to the operational to the tactical level, and thus an inability to truly fully separate into spheres of influence. Why does it matter which one of these you believe? Well, it matters in part for this reason. There is a great deal of friction always in administrations in the United States about the proper role of civilian advice, the proper role and what constitutes independent military advice. And this is largely deriving from which of these models or what model, if it's a permutation of those, you believe is operational at any given time. Civilians often live more in the bottom, in the world that L.A. Cohen has described, excuse me, on the prior page. And military often live at the higher level. They've been taught in the Huntingtonian objective control tradition that there's a more linear relationship. This disconnect creates lots of problems that I think our first panel will be able to focus on. On to militarization of foreign policy. We've had several key writers in this area. Dave Barno has written about the Walmartization of the military, in which you can come to the military to respond to any need. Rosa Brooks has written a book, as the quote there at the bottom takes from there, about how everything became war and the military became everything. And she also speaks about sort of the pernicious effect of that, creating a devastating cycle in which our other instruments of power don't become resourced to the degree we need them to be, because we turn repeat time and time again to the military. What are the consequences of that for our foreign policy, our security policy, and of course for civil-military relations? Let me turn it over to Alice to talk a little on the next slide.
Okay, so next is the realm of politics. Insulating the military from politics and vice versa has been a cornerstone of how we've managed military affairs and indeed our democracy since 1789. But recent years have seen an increase in the visibility of military officers in partisan campaigns and political bargaining. So what role are active duty and retired officers playing in political debates today? How did it get that way? How is the military profession responding to members' political activities? Do civilians seek out officers with certain political ideologies, or do they assume partisan loyalties exist? And how might such conditions affect politics and policy itself? We're focusing in particular, in part because of our recent experience in the 2016 presidential election, on the fierce debate about retired officers' endorsements of the candidates. It's important to recall that the concern about retired officer political endorsements is actually at least 3 decades old, if not older. Retired Marine Corps Commandant General P.X. Kelly, for example, campaigned for George H.W. Bush in 1988, and Admiral William Crowe endorsed candidate Bill Clinton in 1992. Although no one questions retired general and flag officers' right to be politically active once they transition to civilian life, there are many who argue that professional standards nevertheless should limit what those officers do in the political arena, and there's a real debate active there. Some warn that the danger behind a politically active retired general officer cohort is that senior political leaders may begin to wonder if those still on active duty have political ambitions as well. Broader official Washington may view the military as just another political interest group, and the public may lose some of the faith and credibility that made officers' endorsements so politically valuable in the first place. Of course, our most recent political cycle also raised the issue of recently retired general and flag officers assuming politically appointed positions. The debate over the waiver Secretary Mattis needed to take the lead at the Defense Department forced us to revisit Cold War-era norms of civilian control. Some believe that a trend towards senior officers assuming political roles shortly after their military retirement risks politicizing the force, either in reality or in perception. Whereas others argue that there are no perceptible risks to civilian control or military politicization, and that senior officers may bring unique leadership and national security expertise to bear in these roles. So the question is, will military expertise begin to crowd out those with solely civilian backgrounds, and would that be desirable or dangerous? Pardon me. To be sure, politicization of the force is not a new concern. As we have written here at CSIS, there's been a long concern that a partisan force is vulnerable to politicians' suspicion or manipulation, a state of affairs that can undermine the civil-military working relationship, certainly at elite levels, but also with society. Several decades of survey research have shown a shift in political ideology in the armed forces overall, from a force that largely registered as independent after World War II and many senior leaders who avowedly did not vote, to one that identifies as slightly to very conservative in political ideology. There's a range of opinions among analysts about whether private political ideology matters, whether it can or does affect civil-military relations or policy outcomes. Jim Golby, who's one of our panelists here today, has studied this and suggests that partisan ideology can inform ideas about the use of force and trust in political leadership among both military officials and civilians alike. This implies that policy choices may be influenced by the ideological dynamic between military advisors and civilian officials. In our increasingly politically polarized era, we think it's worth considering the consequences of partisan sentiment among those who serve in the military and how partisanship also informs civilian management of the military. What are the appropriate expressions of such sentiment among the military and among civilian leaders? How does the military profession respond to these sentiments, and how do politicians and ordinary citizens contribute to these current trends? Finally, we consider what's often called the military-society relationship in civil-military relations, and here we're just referring to as the public. For years, analysts have observed various gaps between the American public and the military. Among these are gaps in understanding the purpose of the military instrument, gaps in wartime experience and sacrifice, and demographic gaps between those who serve and the general population. We're asking what these experience and representation gaps mean for how this country will use the military instrument in the future. Does it matter that many Americans do not have an appreciation for the missions our service members perform overseas? Is the military truly disconnected from the country or only part of the country? Should and can a professional force be representative of the public more broadly? And should military service be more prevalent among elected officials? So today, civil-military relations experts like Kori Schake have observed that public trust in the military tops that for every other governing and public institution. Importantly, this means that Americans' faith in the military far exceeds their faith in political leaders. Behind this esteem, however, is a troubling degree of unfamiliarity. The YouGov poll that Kori Schake and General Mattis, now Secretary Mattis, commissioned in 2013 for their book asked questions about the use of force, military hierarchy, and military law. And up to 34% of respondents for each of these questions weren't sure of the answers. But perhaps the most striking was the question asking those surveyed, how many people serve in the United States Armed Forces? The mean response, more than 6 million people, off by more than a factor of 3. What are the consequences of such broad support with such shallow understanding? Is public support for military operations more stable or more perishable? Will political officials lose a sense of accountability to the public from military matters? Will future leaders be able to make hard choices about budgeting if public opinion cannot absorb nuance? And I'll turn it back over to Kath.
So why do we have this unfamiliarity? Well, one strong body of research centers around who actually serves and how that might contribute to this unfamiliarity. What you see is the American population on your left and active duty personnel on your right, and the racial makeup of those individuals. What we have found in this kind of research is that military service is broadly representative of the American racial demographic. But if you look beyond race, for instance, to geography, what you find is indeed some disparity in terms of who is serving. There is evidence that the force's economic and geographic demographics do not, similarly like racial demographics, mirror the American population. And in particular, this is showing just enlisted personnel, but enlisted personnel are being drawn from the South in disproportionate numbers. Some have begun to ask whether these sorts of dynamics are creating a warrior caste in the United States, meaning that an increasingly limited number of Americans serve, or even that the same families serve generation after generation. So in a straw poll, raise your hand if you or someone in your immediate family is or has served in the armed forces. Okay? And we are at a civil military relations conference, so chances are good people care about civil military relations. But, so again, just a straw poll, but demonstrative, I think, of how, the fact that those who are really interested in this issue and care about this issue probably have a familial relationship or a personal relationship to service. If the burden of military service, and especially of military operations, often falls on a small slice of the population, what are those implications for civil military relations broadly and for the use of force in particular? And we think our third panel will be able to dig into some of these issues. I want to end with this final slide to draw attention to the fact that this cycle, if you will, this life cycle of issues around civil-military relations really does extend into the veterans realm. This is where Phil Carter and his team at the Center for New American Security, I know Phil is in the room, have done tremendous work. And I think it's worth us pausing here to talk about the fact that the legacy of 16 years of war on the force, but also on the force's relationship with society, is a big question. We know the American public continues to revere its military. The polling, as Alice showed, demonstrates that. We also suspect an imbalance in the operational burden of war. We know that from the demographics and also from the, if you will, the overemphasis on the military instrument. And we worry about what this will have in terms of a generational impact on families that serve. If the World War II generation shaped our approach to domestic and foreign policy through the Cold War, there are questions about what the effect of the 9/11 and post 9/11 generation of veterans will have on our politics, on our society, and how we think about civil-military relations in terms of policy and use of force. Are we going to end up with a truly isolated military warrior caste and an unfamiliar civilian population, or are there things we can do now while the public is so positively inclined to trying to nurture its veteran population and also the military to make sure that we can protect the appropriate civil-military relations over the long term? So I'm going to pause there and turn this back over to Alice, who will be able to introduce the first panel.
And actually, my Marine Corps colleagues who taught me that early is on time would be proud of us because we are running a little bit early. So what we're going to do in order to switch over to the first panel, which will be on the military and policy, is take about a 10-minute break. So if you didn't grab your coffee yet, go get it. And please be back here in 10 minutes for Dr. Janine Davidson, Admiral Bill Gortney, Dr. Corey Shockey, and Major General Richard Clark. Thanks so much.